In this video, I'm going to show you how to build and sell APIs using Next.js, Prisma, and RapidAPI. What's up, everyone? If you're new to the channel, my name is James Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. And I love building things, and I love being able to make money as a developer too. So we're going to combine both of those things into this video where we're going to build an API for one of my favorite book series of all times. The content isn't the most important. It's kind of the idea of what we're doing, but we're going to build this API using serverless API endpoints inside of Next.js. We're going to deploy this to Vercel, and then we're going to publish this inside of RapidAPI so that we can sell this API and make money. So if you have any ideas for data that you think would make sense as an API, this is a great way that you can progress through building it and then selling it in the end. So quick reminder that this video is sponsored by RapidAPI, and I'll have a link in the description below for you to sign up for the RapidAPI Studio where you can follow along and host your very own API. So there's a couple of resources that are important. So there's the GitHub repository with the source code for this. So if you want to follow along, I will also copy a few different snippets out of this source code into the project as we build it. So if you want to follow along, this would be a good resource to have. The link is in the description below. So there's the GitHub repository. I also am using PlanetScale as my database. So PlanetScale is a MySQL database, serverless database. So that's what I'm using. You can sign up for a free account, and then you can create your database right there. We'll go through this process. And the last thing is, this is actually kind of an updated version or a slightly different version of a previous video that I did, which was build a Node Express API with TypeScript, PlanetScale, and web scraping with Cheerio. So if you're interested in checking that out, you'll have a link to that you can check out as well. So the first thing I'm going to do inside of PlanetScale, again with my free account, you could use any SQL database if you wanted to. You could use MySQL, you could use Postgres. I'll show you where that configuration changes when we use Prisma as our ORM. But I'm going to create a new database in here, and this is going to be our throne of glass, and I'll call this 2 because I've already done this in the past. So we're going to create that database. And PlanetScale uses branches. So by default, we're going to be on a main branch, and we're going to update the code in the main branch or update the schema in the main branch. And to do that, we're going to use Prisma inside of Next.js. So let's go ahead and get set up and search for new Next.js project. Now in this example, we're going to use TypeScript. So we're going to make sure that we look for the command that leverages TypeScript. So it's npx create next app latest -- TypeScript. So that's the command that we want to run. I'm going to do this inside of my terminal inside of VS Code. My app is going to be throne of glass API. And then it'll go ahead and install. After that's done, I'll open this up inside of the same VS Code window so that we can get started integrating Prisma with Next.js. Now, as that's installing, we can go ahead and search for this. So Prisma Next.js. And there's a nice tutorial on the Vercel page about setting this up, so we can scroll down and follow those instructions, which start with creating a new app, and then we'll go down to the Prisma piece where we run npm install Prisma, use that to init our setup inside of our code base. So this should have gone ahead and created. I'm going to do code-r and open this folder up inside of the current window, and now you see I've got my files inside of here. All right, so now I can run the install of Prisma, and this is a dev dependency. So npm install Prisma save dev, not def. Wow, interesting. So not save def, and I want to make sure I uninstall this and get this correctly. So -- save - dev. I guess I ought to use my IntelliSense there instead of typing it in myself, and that should have been install. Eventually, we'll get the correct install. Okay. And then we'll run the command npx prisma init. So this is going to do a little bit of initialization with Prisma so that we can set it up to work with our database. All right, so this added for us a .env file that has a connection string inside of it. So whatever kind of database you're using, you'll need to make sure to update this connection string. I'll show you how to do that with PlanetScale here in a second. The other thing you'll notice is that this .env is green, which means we need to make sure we ignore this file. So we'll ignore this and the .get ignored and make sure that environment variable file never gets checked in. So that should go gray here in a second. All right, so now that is grayed out. The other thing you'll notice is we have this Prisma directory with a schema.prisma file. So this is going to be the configuration for our database and the place where we actually define our schema. So this is set up by default to work with Postgres. So if you're working with Postgres, you can update that environment variable inside of your .env file. But if you're working with PlanetScale, the configuration is slightly different. So I'm going to paste this in, and then I'll show you the two properties that are different. So we've added the referential integrity piece here, and then the preview features to enable the referential integrity here. Those are the two different lines that are different with PlanetScale versus just working with Postgres. So either way, you're totally fine. So the last thing we need to do is actually add our connection string for this database. So let's go into our branches and into the main branch, and then we'll click on connect. And PlanetScale is actually going to generate a Prisma one by default for me. So if Prisma isn't selected, select Prisma, copy that connection string, and I'm going to paste this into our .env. All right, so there is our .env. Now that we have the connection stuff set up, we need to add an actual schema for the Throne of Glass API. So let's search for Throne of Glass wiki on fandom. And this is where all of our information is coming from. So here's the main character, Aelin, and here's the information from her. So we're going to go and grab all that information and save it inside of our database. So what does that model look like? Well, I'm going to copy and paste in. Again, you've got the source code, or you can take a second and pause and copy this manually. But this is a TOG character table, so Throne of Glass, and it's going to have a few simple properties like ID, name, species, and then an optional image. So that's the schema for this. Now we can run npx prisma db push. This is actually going to push this schema to our PlanetScale database. So after this finishes, we should be able to go back into PlanetScale, get rid of the pop-up, go into schema, and now we see that the schema has been deployed, which is great. So the other thing we need to do is create a seed file inside of this directory. So seed.ts, and I am going to copy this code in as well. And this is because you've got the source code, and this is not the focus of this content. It's just a piece of this. So you can copy and paste it in if you want to, but we'll walk through really quickly what it does. So notice there's this long array of character names. These are going to be the different pages that we want to grab information from to get the information about these characters. So we have those pages, and then we have a load characters function, which is going to get character info for each one of them, and then create all those characters inside of our database using Prisma. All right, so that seems like it's going to work well. The other piece in here is that it's going to get the information by scraping those individual web pages using Cheerio and Axios. Again, if you want to learn more about how this works, I did a full explanation in that previous video using TypeScript within a Node Express app, but the idea is exactly the same. But the takeaway here is that this code is grabbing all the information for each individual character, and then lastly, it's saving that information into our database by using Prisma there. So to do this, we'll need a couple of different files here, packages. We'll need Axios, Cheerio, and the .env package. So we'll let those install, and then we'll want to create a seed command inside of our package.json to actually be able to run this. Now, the other thing we'll need is to install the Prisma client package as well. So that should be all the packages. So let's go into our package.json, and we're going to add a script here for seed. Now to do this, we actually are going to need another package. So I lied about packages. We're going to need to install TS node, and this is going to be a dev dependency. So we're going to use TS node to run that seed file outside of Next.js because it's not running within the Next.js application. It's just running on its own. So now that we have that installed, we can run TS node prisma seed.ts. All right, so now that we have that in, hopefully we can run npm run seed. And we've got one issue that we need to take care of. So inside of our TS config here, we need to set a configuration for TS node to be able to run, specifically what kind of module system it wants to use. So in this case, I'm pasting in this configuration for TS node, which is then an object with compiler options and then module node 16. So again, you've got the final source code where you can copy this in, or you can pause this and paste it or type it in yourself. So now we should be able to run our npm run seed again, and this will now populate our database with all of our characters. So it looks like that worked. And we can actually come back into PlanetScale, go into the console, and do a select star from TOG character, and hopefully see all of our data. Now, another cool thing we can do is we can run the npx Prisma Studio command. This will open a GUI representation of our database. This went right to our TOG character. It'll probably take you here by default, but then you open up that table and you can see all the data inside of Prisma Studio, which is a nice little add-on that we can take advantage of. All right, so now that we've got our data populated, we can start to work on the actual API endpoints in Next.js. So inside of our pages directory, inside of API, we're going to create another folder called characters. Inside of here, we're going to start with an index.ts file. All right, so we're going to define our handler. This is our API endpoint handler. We're going to set this to an async function that has a request, which is next API request. Then we'll have a response, which is next API response. And then inside of here, it's going to return a res.status of 200, and then JSON with an object with a message property of hello world. So this is just to test this out and see how it works. And then lastly, we need to export the default handler. All right, so let's kill the Prisma Studio. Let's do an npm run dev now. Let's get this up and running. And hopefully what we'll see, if we go to localhost 3000, we'll see our Next.js project. And then if we go to /API/characters, we see our hello world message is coming back. So this API endpoint is working. Now, another thing we can do, instead of switching back and forth between the browser and VS Code, we can use the RapidAPI client inside of VS Code to be able to test these endpoints. So let's create, we could create a new endpoint and I could paste that in. One cool thing that you can do also is do Command-Shift-P and then RapidAPI and then create new requests from clipboard. So because I had that URL already copied to my clipboard, it's going to allow me to paste this in, and now I can click send. Now, a couple other things that are cool about this is you can generate code snippets. So if I wanted to generate a code snippet for how to call this endpoint using Axios, for example, it'll show me what the code for that looks like. I can also then generate type definitions for the data that comes back by calling JSON to and then clicking on TypeScript. In this case, it's going to give me something. This was just a test, so it's just giving me a message property. But once you get into actual data, you can generate those snippets for you. So we can now test our stuff inside of /API/characters. So let's go back here. And the thing we need to do now, we've worked with Prisma to connect to our database, but now we need to configure the Prisma client. So let's install, or actually, I think we've already installed the Prisma client. Let's double check that. Prisma client. Yep. So we already have that installed. Now there is a little bit of configuration that it takes to set up Prisma client with Next.js. So we're just going to copy that in. So there's a best practices doc from Prisma on instantiating the Prisma client with Next.js. And we can copy this whole file into a Prisma utils file. So I'm going to create a new directory called utils. And then I'm going to create a new file, prisma.ts, and just paste this configuration in. So this will make sure that we're not recreating Prisma connections here. It'll give us kind of one connection that we can work with throughout our application. So anytime we reference the Prisma client, we're going to get it, we're going to import it from this utils directory here. So now let's go ahead and import our new Prisma from, we'll have to go back a few different directories into our utils and then into Prisma. And now we can use this Prisma client to be able to query our data. So the easiest thing that we can do is start to make a request to get all of our characters. So if we say const and then characters, and then we can await the response from Prisma. Now Prisma now is going to run, or we need to access the table that we want to access. It already has given us IntelliSense for this, so TOG character. And then we can call find many. And then lastly, we can return our characters. Okay. So if we save this, let's run our application again. And now I can tab back over to our request inside of the RapidAPI client. Let's send this again, and hopefully now we see all of our data is coming back, which is great. So if we scroll all the way down, I think this will give us 85 different characters. So we're able to query all that information, and that works, but we want to add a little bit of configuration here for people to pass in query parameters to then be able to limit the amount of characters that they get and or add a skip. So they want to skip the first 10 characters, for example, if they want to add pagination. But the first thing I want to check to make sure is just that the rec.method is a GET request, or actually if it is not a GET request, we want to return back a res.status of 405. All right, so we'll handle that. We want to make sure this is only GET requests that are coming in. Then now we can allow a user to pass in a query parameter inside of the request like so. So if we do question mark and then limit equals 5, now we can now limit how many characters we return. So we're going to need to get that limit from rec.query.limit. So that's where you get all of your query parameters, is from this query property of the request object. So we're going to do this for limit, and then we'll do this for a skip. So if they want to skip a certain amount. Now we want to do a little bit of validation on this limit to make sure that it is an actual number. So first we're going to need to convert this to a limit string, because limit can either be a string or a string array. So I want to make sure that we just get the actual string. So we're going to say if this limit property is an array, then we want to return the first item out of that array, or we want to return the limit itself. So this is a little bit of trick just to make sure that this property is a string and not an array. So then we can do the same thing with our skip, and then we'll just replace all the limit references in here with skip. So we have a limit string and a skip string, but again, we want to make sure that these things are actually numbers and not then strings. So let's say if we have a limit string, let's assign this to a property called take, and we're going to call parse int on that limit string. Now we're calling this take because that's what Prisma references this as. And then lastly, we're going to say if the take is not a number. So isNaN is a function in JavaScript. If that is the case, we're going to return an error here to say that's an invalid request. So I'm going to paste this one in and just say we're going to return a status of 400 with an error message that says, please enter a valid number. Now we're going to do almost the exact same thing for our skip string as well. So we'll have that skip there, and then we'll call this property skip, this property skip string, and then replace this with skip again. Again, just doing kind of the boring validation piece. So now we're validating that if they pass in either one of those parameters, it should be a number. Now, the last thing we want to do is actually pass this stuff into a config object that's going to look like this. So we might have take 5, and then we might have a skip 5. So we want to build up a config object for this query and take into account the parameters that they're adding, that the user is inputting into this, into the query parameters. So we can initialize a query config as an empty object and then add those properties to it. So if this thing is a limit, if there is a limit string that's passed in, if it has already passed this check, now we can add query config dot take equals take. All right, and this is going to give us a little bit of problem because we're using TypeScript, which is okay because it's wanting definitions here. We can add that in a second. And then if they have the skip string, we can say that skip equals skip as well. Now to fix this, the TypeScript errors, we can define a type for our query config up here. That's just saying this is going to take in a skip and a take parameter or object property, which is both optional. And then we can define this to be of type query config. All right, so those go away. And then we'll just pass in our query config to our find many. Now we can start to test this, but I think we've got one little bug in here where the skip should have been referencing the skip parameter and not the limit parameter. So now let's go in and run this query again. It should work just like it had before. It's going to return all of these, which is great. Now I can add a limit property of 5. All right, so let's see if we only get 5 back. We do. And then we can add in our skip property of 10, for example. And now we should get 11 through 15. So that is working perfectly. We're able to let the user query all of the characters and then limit the number of characters and or skip a certain amount of characters as well. Now, the next thing we're going to do is add a new file for a dynamic route in this case. And so a dynamic route is basically we're going to be able to pull part of the route path from /character/2, for example, grab that 2, and now use that to be able to query against it inside of our database. So we're going to start off with a similar handler here. So this is going to be an async function. It'll have a request, which is next API request. It'll have a response of next API response. And we can do our same check here. So this is going to be a get request only. So we can paste in that same check. And then next, we want to get access to the actual ID from this path. So they will go to /character/ and then an ID. So we can say that the ID is coming from rec.query.id. And let's just let's just send this back in a response. So let's do res.json, and then we'll say ID to see if this is coming, if we're querying this correctly. So let's go back to our request in here. And now instead of characters and then query parameters, we can do /2, for example. We're getting an error, but we also forgot to export default of our handler. So make sure that you do that. Now we can test this again, and we're getting our ID coming back as 2. Great. Now notice that that was a string, so we still need to convert this to a number. So we can take our ID here and then do the same trick that we did before, where we're going to check if it is an array, then we want to get the item out of the array. Otherwise, we can just get the item directly. So a little bit of a trick we have to do to make sure we're getting the right thing. And then we can call or say ID num is going to be parse int of our ID string. And just like we did before, we can say if this is not a number, ID num, then we're going to return res.status of 400 and give a JSON response with an error that says, please enter a valid number for character ID. All right, so this is just our basic validation here. And now what we can do is we can run our Prisma and assign it to a character to query prisma.tog character. And then now we'll call find unique. So instead of find many, we're calling find unique. And we pass in here a configuration object where we clarify we're looking for a where clause where the ID equals ID num. So this is how we can query the individual character there. And then we can just respond back with the actual character itself. So let's return that back. And if we come back into our request, we now have the ability to query this, and we should get back an individual character. So if we change this to a different ID, we get another one, and so on and so on. So all of our API endpoints are working. So now we want to deploy and host this application inside of Vercel, and then we can register this API inside of RapidAPI so that you can sell access to the API and make money. So to do this, we're going to need a GitHub repository. So I've got the GitHub CLI installed where I can run GitHub repo create, and this is going to create a repository for me. And I'm going to create push from an existing local repository. The local repository is here at this directory. We'll call this Throne of Glass API 2. This is the second time I've done this, as you can imagine. And we'll say, in this case, it can be public. That's fine. We're going to add our remote, and remote will be called origin. And then we would go ahead and push everything from our local to our remote. So that should be good. If we come into GitHub, I should be able to search for the Throne of Glass API 2. So there is our new repository. And now we can come to Vercel to set up the hosting for this. If you don't have a free account already, you can set up a free account. And then you'll come into new project, and we want to import this from a GitHub repository, which in this case is our Throne of Glass API 2. So we'll import this. One of the things that we need to add is an environment variable for our database. So we'll add that. Remember, this is inside of our .env. So you can just grab that property and copy and paste this into the dashboard. And then we'll run a deploy. So this should go ahead and run a build and then host this thing on Vercel so that we can then reference this inside of RapidAPI. All right, so this is working. If we go to our dashboard, you can see that we're going to have a visit button, and then we'll have a URL here. So Throne of Glass API-2. So it's given us that unique name there. And then if I go, we didn't add a index page, so you could go and style that and create it if you wanted to. But if we go to API and then characters, we should get all the data back. And it looks like we don't. And the reason is, I believe I forgot to actually check in these new API routes. So let's do a git add of star. So I've added all those files. Now I can run a git commit -m of initial commit, although it's not really the initial commit. And now I can run a git push to push this stuff up. Now the cool thing is, now that we've already got the connection inside of Vercel to our GitHub repository, it's going to automatically kick off this build once we push code to the repository. So it's automatically going to kick off this build, and then we'll be able to go in and test the API endpoints. All right, so it looks like it finished that build. Now let's try this again. So API/characters and refresh. And we're getting a 500 error, and I'm wondering if we maybe didn't update our environment variables. So I went inside of functions and looked in here, and it looks like it's having a hard time finding that database URL property. So let's make sure that we have this. Let's go back to the application itself. Let's go into settings and then our environment variables. And it looks like maybe I didn't save that property. So let's do database URL. I'm going to go back through my history and copy in that URL. So let's go ahead and add that there. And unfortunately, now we'll have to do another deploy. So we can take this existing one and we can call redeploy. So this should run another build, and then now we should be able to test this API endpoint. All right, so this newest build is done. We'll see, fingers crossed, that we can get some data back this time. Oh, thank you. And we get it all back, and we can also do our limits. So we can do a limit of 5, for example. That only gets 5, cool. And then we can also add in our skip parameter of maybe, let's skip 50. So there's 51, cool. And then lastly, can we get the specific character? So characters/2 gives us 1 character, although it looks like that is having an issue as well. So we can come back into our functions and we can look at this. Reference Prisma is not defined. So let's go back. I'm not sure how I was able to get a reference, or how I was able to use this. I don't know how that worked before. Has anybody ever had that type of situation? So anyway, can we get an automatic import in here? Looks like we didn't. So let's do an import of Prisma from, and then we'll go back a few different directories to utils and then Prisma. And hopefully that will work. So I'm going to get, oh, not there. All right, so let's do git add star, git commit, updated, missing Prisma reference, and then git push. Now this will go ahead again and kick off a build for that whole process. I'll pause this and then we'll come back just to make sure that this works. All right, so I let it finish its build, and now that API is finally working, which is great. So we've got all that stuff taken care of. It's hosted on Vercel, which is nice. The API is ready to use, and it's ready to add into RapidAPI so that we can go ahead and sell this project. So let's go and add an API project in here. We'll call this Throne of Glass API 2, again, because I've done this before. This is going to be an API for Throne of Glass characters. I guess this is just under entertainment. Team will be personal. We're not going to import any data. So we'll go ahead and add this API project. All right, and now we're going to come over to our hub listing. So this is going to be what people are able to see. So we can add website, README information, terms of use, a lot of different things. We can check to see whether or not this thing is going to be private. Obviously, you'll want to make sure this is public for people to be able to find it. All right, so you'll see something like this, API project is public. Now we're gonna add in our base URL. So I'm gonna paste in the Throne of Glass API endpoint that we had, which is that website or that link at Vercel. So that's the endpoint for our URL. Let's go ahead and save, or let's get rid of that extra one and save this. And so now we'll come over to our endpoints. This is where you can communicate to people. These are the types of requests that you can make. So we'll say get all characters, then get all the characters with options to limit amount of responses and skip an amount of characters. All right, so that's going to be that. And then the slash is going to be to that root URL /API/characters. Now, this is pretty cool that you can define these parameter names. So in this case, we'll call this limit. And this is going to be not required, so it's just an option. And then we'll have a skip as well. So we have those two parameters. It shows you a little code snippet here, which is kind of cool, of if people were to make a request to this endpoint, what it would look like with, in this case, Node.js and Axios, and they have other snippets as well. So let's go ahead and save that. And so we should be able to see this endpoint here. So that's good. And then we can create a new endpoint, and this is going to be almost the same thing, but this is going to be get character by ID. So get an individual character. And then we can define that these are path parameters. So this is going to be API/characters, and then in curly braces, we're going to have ID. That's defining this as a path parameter. So they're going to need to make a request. This thing is required to /API/characters/ID. Then we can save that as well. All right, now the last piece is we can now check the monetization. So we can say this is a free tier, and then instead of having this be unlimited, we can limit this to a certain amount of requests. So we can say this is going to have, let's say, an hour. We can make 10 requests per hour. That's fine. So that'll be the free tier. Then if you upgrade to the pro, you can have a rate limit and say this is going to be 100 requests per hour if you want to. And we'll say this is $10 a month. So if you want to make more requests, you can upgrade to this pro tier. You can also configure like 3 and 4 different tiers if you want to. You can control exactly the pricing and then the usage for these as well. So we configured the rate limiting for these. So 10 per hour, 100 per hour, etc. But we also need to limit the request per day or month. So we can say that the quota limit on the free tier is maybe 500 a month. This is a soft or hard limit. So if they hit this limit, should they be allowed to do more? I'm going to call this a hard limit and just say they're going to be cut off there. And then in the higher tier, let's say on a monthly basis, you could get 5,000 requests a month. Again, you can configure this to work any way that you want to, that you think works for your use case. So that works really well. So this is inside of the RapidAPI Studio to be able to configure this stuff. And then this is going to be the landing page inside of RapidAPI, where we can see this is what different people see when they come to use these endpoints. So you can see the two different endpoints here, get character by ID. There's a test here for this endpoint. It's letting us know that this ID is required, which is good. And you can see back that we get our response, which is great. And then you can also see we have our other endpoint, which is get all characters. So this is how other people would see the listing of your API, and then they would make these requests, again, code snippets here, which is pretty nice, and include their API keys and send this to the full URL at rapidapi.com / the endings, the endpoints that we define. So that was creating and selling an API with Next.js, with TypeScript, with Vercel, PlanetScale, Prisma, and RapidAPI, all in a pretty cool project to be able to web scrape and generate our own data. So remember, you can do this with any type of data that you want. Bring in data from outside sources, or maybe you already have data that you can offer in an API. You can build it out, you can deploy it for free to Vercel, and then you can sell it on RapidAPI. So hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what questions or comments you have about the video and what other types of tutorials you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for checking out the video, and I'll see you next time.